It started as an ordinary afternoon, nothing out of the usual. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden hue over the small pharmacy on the corner of Maple Street. Inside, a teenage boy named Jake stood in line, scrolling through his phone, half listening to the faint chatter around him. He had just finished school and stopped by to grab a snack before heading home. But fate had other plans. A few spots ahead of him stood an elderly woman, her silver hair neatly tucked under a faded blue hat. She clutched a small purse, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out a few crumpled bills. The pharmacist gave her a sympathetic look, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your insurance doesn't cover the full amount. It'll be $62. The woman's shoulders sank. She fumbled through her purse again, counting the bills, her lips pressing into a thin line. It wasn't enough. Jake watched, his heart tightening. He wasn't the kind of guy who usually paid much attention to strangers, but something about her, maybe the way she hesitated, maybe the silent defeat in her eyes, made it impossible to look away. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who had been through too much and had run out of options. Before he could second-guess himself, Jake stepped forward. "I'll cover it," he said, pulling out his wallet. The words left his mouth before he even had time to think them through. The woman turned, her faded blue eyes widening. "Oh, sweetheart, that's very kind, but you don't have to. I want to," Jake interrupted, handing over his card before she could protest further. It's no big deal, but to her it was. She stared at him for a long moment, as if memorizing his face. Then, with a gentle smile, she whispered, "Thank you. You have no idea what this means." She took the small paper bag from the pharmacist, gripping it like it was something precious. As she turned to leave, she paused, reached into her purse, and pulled out a small folded note. With delicate fingers, she placed it in Jake's hand. "Read this when you get home," she said softly. Then with one last grateful glance, she walked away. Jake slipped the note into his pocket, thinking nothing of it. He had no idea that inside that small piece of paper were words that would shake his world. Words that would change everything he thought he knew about life, kindness, and fate. But by the time he unfolded it, it was already too late to turn back. Jake didn't think much about the note at first. It stayed in his pocket for the rest of the evening, crumpled against his phone as he went about his usual routine, grabbing a quick bite, finishing up his homework, scrolling through social media. It was only later, when he was getting ready for bed, that he remembered it. He pulled it out, smoothing the creases with his fingers. The handwriting was neat, but a little shaky, like someone who had written the words with great care, but not without effort. "You changed my life today. I hope one day this kindness comes back to you when you need it most. But there's something you should know." Jake frowned, his eyes darting to the next lines. "Many years ago, I met a boy just like you. He did something for me that seemed small at the time, but meant everything. It set my life on a path I never expected. What you did today wasn't just an act of kindness. It was fate coming full circle." His heart pounded a little harder in his chest. What did that mean? Who was this woman? And how was he somehow connected to her past? The words kept running through his mind the next day at school, distracting him from lectures, from lunch, from the usual small talk with his friends. He knew he couldn't just ignore it. He had to find her again. After school, he went back to the pharmacy, hoping she might show up, but she was nowhere to be seen. He asked the pharmacist, describing her as best as he could. The blue hat, the gentle voice, the way she had hesitated at the counter. The pharmacist thought for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I think that's Mrs. Callahan. She comes in every now and then for her medication. "Do you know where she lives?" Jake asked, feeling a strange urgency. The pharmacist hesitated. "I can't give out personal details, but I know she volunteers at the community center, a few blocks away. You might find her there." Jake thanked him and left, gripping the note in his pocket as he made his way toward the community center. The building was old but welcoming, with kids running around outside and a few elderly folks sitting on the benches, chatting. Inside, he found a woman at the front desk and asked about Mrs. Callahan. "Oh, yes," the woman said warmly. "She's in the reading room, helping with the children's book club." Jake followed the sound of soft voices and laughter until he saw her, sitting in a chair, a small group of kids gathered around her as she read from an old, worn book. The scene felt oddly comforting, as if he had stepped into a moment frozen in time. When she finished the story, the children clapped, and she smiled before glancing up. Her eyes met Jake's, and for a second, there was a flicker of recognition. "I was hoping I'd see you again," she said, rising to her feet. Jake walked over, still gripping the note. "I read what you wrote," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. "I don't understand what you meant." She gestured to a bench near the window, and they sat down. She took a deep breath before speaking. "A long time ago," she began. "When I was about your age, I was struggling. My family didn't have much, and I had just lost my father. I felt lost, alone. One day I was at a diner, sitting by myself, trying to figure out how I was going to pay for my meal. And then a boy, about your age, walked up and left some money on my table. He didn't say much, just smiled and told me to take care of myself." Jake listened, unsure where this was going, but feeling the weight in her voice. "That small act of kindness changed everything for me," she continued. "It gave me hope at a time when I had none." That boy's name was Daniel Harper. Jake's stomach flipped. Daniel Harper. He knew that name. He had heard it 100 times before. She nodded. "Yes. He grew up to be a wonderful man. Kind, generous. He built a life on helping others. He inspired so many people, including me." Jake swallowed hard. "Mrs. Callahan. Daniel Harper was my grandfather." A silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Mrs. Callahan's eyes softened, a small knowing smile forming on her lips. "Fate works in mysterious ways, doesn't it?" she said. "Your grandfather's kindness found its way back to me all those years later. And now you, his grandson, have given me another reason to believe in the power of goodness." Jake felt his throat tighten. He had never met his grandfather. He had passed away long before Jake was born. But his family always spoke of him as someone special, a man who had left behind a legacy of kindness. And now, without even realizing it, Jake had unknowingly continued that legacy. The weight of it all settled in his chest. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was something bigger. Mrs. Callahan reached for his hand, her grip warm and steady. "Your kindness will come back to you, Jake. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day when you need it most." Jake didn't know what to say. He just nodded, feeling something shift inside him. Little did he know, that day would come much sooner than he ever expected. The days that followed felt different for Jake. The conversation with Mrs. Callahan stayed with him, settling into his thoughts like a song stuck on repeat. It wasn't just about what she had told him. It was the way it made him feel, like he was part of something bigger, like his actions, no matter how small, had the power to shape someone's life. He had never thought of kindness that way before. Life moved on as usual. School, work, the occasional hangout with friends. But a part of him felt changed. He found himself paying more attention to the people around him. the quiet kid who always sat alone at lunch, the exhausted cashier at the grocery store, the neighbor struggling with her heavy bags. Small things he had never really noticed before now seemed impossible to ignore. Then, one evening, the moment Mrs. Callahan had spoken about, the one where kindness would come back to him, arrived in a way he never expected. It was late, and the rain had started coming down in heavy sheets. Jake was on his way home when his car suddenly sputtered, then died right at a lonely intersection. He tried the ignition, but nothing. His phone buzzed at 2% battery. No charger, no way to call for help. He sighed, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. This was not how he wanted to end his night. Then, out of nowhere, a pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. A car pulled up behind him, and a tall figure stepped out, holding an umbrella against the rain. The man knocked on Jake's window, and after a hesitant second, Jake rolled it down slightly. "Car trouble?" the man asked, his voice calm. "Yeah," Jake admitted. "Won't start," the man nodded. "Pop the hood. Let's take a look." Jake hesitated, but did as he was told. The man grabbed a flashlight from his truck and peered into the engine. After a few moments, he nodded to himself, then disappeared into his vehicle and returned with jumper cables. "Battery's dead," he said. "Let's get you back on the road." Jake stood there, drenched, watching as the stranger worked. It was such a simple thing, but in that moment, it meant everything. When the engine finally roared back to life, Jake let out a breath of relief. "Thank you," he said, meaning it more than he could put into words. The man just smiled, shaking off the rain from his sleeves. "No problem. We all need a little help sometimes." That's when Jake noticed something. A small pin on the man's jacket, shaped like a star. It looked oddly familiar. "Hey," Jake said, before the man could turn to leave. "I don't know why, but I feel like I've seen that pin before." The man glanced down, then chuckled. It's from an old diner I used to work at when I was a teenager. I used to wear it all the time back then." Something clicked in Jake's mind. His heart pounded. "What was the name of the diner?" he asked carefully. "The Golden Spoon," the man replied. "Used to be on Main Street before it closed down years ago." Jake's breath caught in his throat. The Golden Spoon. The same diner where Mrs. Callahan had said a boy, his grandfather, had once paid for her meal. Jake stared at the man, his thoughts racing. You worked there?" The man nodded. "Yeah, back when I was a kid. One night, I saw this young woman sitting alone. She looked like she was having a rough time. So I left a few dollars on her table. Didn't think much of it. Funny how small things stick with you." Jake felt his stomach flip. That woman. His voice was barely above a whisper. "She never forgot what you did." The man tilted his head, confused. "What do you mean?" Jake swallowed, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. "She told me the story. Mrs. Callahan. You changed her life that night." For the first time, the man looked genuinely surprised. He blinked, as if trying to piece it all together. Then, a slow, thoughtful smile spread across his face. "Well, would you look at that?" Jake couldn't help but smile too, the weight of the moment settling in. It was all connected. His grandfather, Mrs. Callahan, this man, acts of kindness rippling through time, finding their way back when they were needed most. Before the man left, Jake reached into his wallet and pulled out a small bill, pressing it into the man's hand. "For the next person," he said. The man glanced down at the money, then back at Jake, his eyes shining with something unspoken. He nodded. "I'll make sure of it." As Jake drove home, the rain finally easing up, he realized something. Mrs. Callahan was right. Kindness always. finds its way back. Sometimes it just takes a little time.